In 2021, horrible news struck the Catholic Church. A mass grave was found at a residential school for Indians run by the church. Accusations of genocide were made by major news publications, and some Catholic churches were even burned to the ground in response. Only it wasn't a mass grave at all. The sins of the church had been known for decades, and the church had been working with First Nations people for years on truth and reconciliation to bring healing, leading some to dismiss the story entirely, which is a big mistake. While the media frenzy a few years ago might have been misguided, there is no doubt that what Catholics and Christians in general did to Indians in North America is deeply upsetting and still requires tremendous work to heal wounds. So, what actually happened at the residential schools and what is being done about it? This is Catholicism in Focus. Quick note before we begin. There is a lot of debate and little consensus as to what to call people who are indigenous to North America. It's a complicated issue. In this video, I'm going to primarily use the term Indian, but occasionally use Native American, Indigenous, and First Nations. My reason is best captured by this video by C.G.P. Gray. Now, on with the show. By the late 1800s, the days of free-roaming Indians, trading and warring with westward traveling Europeans, had more or less come to an end. Both the US and Canada had taken complete control of the land, and with it, the people inhabiting it, leaving both nations with a rather uncomfortable question. What do you do with the people that are now poor and landless because of our pillaging? Among many things, schools were established for the education of Indians. At these schools, it was believed, students would not only be educated, but they'd be taken care of, receiving food, shelter, and basic health care, things that very few Indians had access to after the US and Canada destroyed their societies and forced them onto reservations. At face value, seen in the most optimistic of lights, it was a humanitarian effort. Each government commissioned religious organizations, those most likely to do charity work, to teach and care for this tragically underserved population so that they might have a good life. Many Christian churches, Catholics chief among them, jumped at the opportunity and sent priests and nuns who were willing to dedicate their lives to these people. There were many heroic, saintly people that sacrificed their lives with the best of intentions. Unfortunately, even the best of intentions can be misguided or have ulterior motives at times. In this case, there was another, arguably more primary reason for the institution of these schools, and it was far from noble. Our nations wanted to assimilate Indians into Western Christian culture. Much more than just providing meals and lessons in arithmetic, it was about teaching them to be like the white man. This meant dropping their native languages and speaking English, losing their traditional garb and dressing properly, forgetting their nomadic lifestyle and living in houses, and most of all, turning from their indigenous faith and adopting Christianity. For many, the goal was to kill the Indian, save the man. A not-so-subtle, not-so-secret motto coined by Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt in 1892 and used by many. Much of this could be accomplished at normal day schools where students returned to their families each night, but there was a limit to the level of assimilation that could take place in these settings. Thus, in many places, residential schools were founded, places where children could be forcibly separated from their families and watched around the clock to ensure that their culture was completely stamped out. And the effects were devastating. While some schools were great, and many Indians today speak of the wonderful opportunities that were afforded to them, far more remember these schools as a place of horror. Ripped from their families, treated as inferior, and forced to deny their culture, it was often a place of emotional, physical, and even sexual abuse. Even in cases where educators cared deeply about the students, research done by the University of British Columbia notes that the lack of funding and oversight led to overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food and health care, all of which, tragically, resulted in a shockingly high death toll. In 1907, Government Medical Inspector P.H. Bryce reported that 24% of previously healthy Indigenous children across Canada were dying in residential schools, which brings us to the news in 2020 of mass graves found near these schools. On May 28, 2021, the New York Times ran an article entitled "Horrible History, Mass Grave of Indigenous Children Reported in Canada," in which it reported that the remains of 215 children were discovered in a mass grave at the site of the long-shuttered Kamloops Indian Residential School. In the coming weeks, more discoveries were reported, adding up to more than 1,300 unidentified children buried across Canada. And so, the word genocide began to be used. Protests erupted. Churches were burned to the ground in what some justified as a long overdue reckoning. The secrets of the church were out, and they needed to pay for what they had done. Only much of this was unsubstantiated, and the real truth had been known for decades, if not an entire century. In some cases, human remains were found on or near the sites of former residential schools because they were church graveyards that had lost their gravestones over the years. They weren't mass graves, they were simply unmarked graves of people, most likely non-Indian, who had had their funerals at a nearby church. In other cases, further excavations of the past 2 years have turned up completely empty. Not a single mass grave has been confirmed, and no new human remains were ever discovered, meaning that much of what was reported was more speculation than fact. The reason for this is because the 2021 report was hardly news. In 2007, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to investigate the legacy of these schools. For 6 years, it uncovered everything we know now, publishing a report in 2015 that accounted for 3,201 children that had perished as a result of these schools. Of course, this comes nearly 100 years after the medical inspector for the Department of Indian Affairs published his report, The Story of a National Crime, being an appeal for justice to the Indians of Canada, accusing the Canadian government of gross indifference to Indian deaths. That was in 1922. Among the things known now, as well as back then, was that tuberculosis, influenza, meningitis, and pneumonia were rampant and sometimes untreatable. The fact that children died and their records have been lost 50, 100, almost 150 years later is not evidence of some intentional mass genocide. It's the product of its time that nearly every school faced. Was there gross negligence, underfunding, physical and emotional abuse on the part of the church supported by the government? Absolutely. But there is no evidence whatsoever for genocide. Which is not to deny wrongdoing or say that it wasn't that bad. What occurred in these places is gravely sinful. But the church had begun to take ownership of these actions long before the media frenzy. Since the initiation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Canadian Catholic bishops had been working with First Nations leaders, listening to their experiences, and seeking justice together. Following the Commission's report in 2015, the bishops put out a letter acknowledging the sins of the church and accepting responsibility, not only for the past wounds, but for the continued process of reconciliation. For 6 years prior to the so-called news of 2021, dioceses in Canada had been reckoning with our past and doing something constructive about it. This includes grants and foundations established for reparations, supporting opportunities to make Indigenous culture more widely known, accompanying Indigenous people in the pursuit of justice, working together with local community leaders to address social challenges including addictions, suicide, violence, poverty, and incarceration, celebrating the great role that women play in many Indigenous faith communities, and identifying new forms of responsibility within dioceses to which Indigenous elders could be invited to share their spiritual wisdom. Is this issue over? Not by a long shot. But progress is being made, and it has been for some time, which makes the aftermath of the recent news so frustrating to the Catholic Church and Indians alike. For many, the outrage of 2021 was unfounded and unwarranted, only deepening the wounds with anger and misinformation. Those who were actually affected by these atrocities were already well aware of what was going on and were already in the process of seeking justice. In fact, it was Indian leaders in 2021 that may have spoken the loudest decrying the vandalism to Catholic churches. Although the church may have hurt many over the years, most Indians did not see violence as a constructive solution, and some even worshipped in the churches that were burned down. Although well-intentioned, the majority of anger faced by the church in 2021 didn't come from people who were actually affected by the church and did more to slow the progress of victims. Which is yet another example in our world of why it pays to listen attentively and to judge slowly. I don't think that there's anyone out there who's going to suggest that the church has done nothing wrong. Our sins are public and without excuse. But it benefits no one to condemn the church for things that we did not do or to shape the facts to tell a more interesting story. If we are to learn from our past and hopefully to avoid making the same mistakes in the future, what we need is to be honest and fair with history.